Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UNEXPLAINED News Radio podcast, your news source for all things unexplained. And now, here's your host for the UNEXPLAINED News podcast, Margie K.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Margie K. I'm the host of UNEXPLAINED News, and you can see this show here every Friday at 5 p.m. right here on YouTube. And I'd ask you to please subscribe so that you can get information about upcoming programs and you don't miss a thing. Also, visit my website, UNEXPLAINED News Media, where we've got information about not only this show, but new shows coming up on the new KUNX radio broadcast network, which I am going to be launching in October. So there's going to be more information about that coming soon. And of course, UNEXPLAINED News Magazine is coming back October 1st. Watch for that as well, either in print or as a digital copy. It is a quarterly magazine, and we've got all kinds of good information in there on every subject you can think of. My guest this evening is the very special and talented writer and talented investigator, Mr. Preston Dennett. Welcome to the program, Preston.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you've been an investigator for over 35 years, correct?
That's right.
And what got you interested in the paranormal subjects?
Oh, never in a million years would I thought I'd be doing this. I can tell you that I was skeptic. I was very skeptical of anything UFOs, anything paranormal. But this news report came on, and this was November 1986. And it talked about a UFO sighting over Alaska, and featured this pilot who had seen a UFO. It tracked his plane. His whole crew saw it. It was on radar. None of this was really on the news report. It was very tongue-in-cheek, very jokey. The newscasters were somewhat skeptical and just sort of joked about it and moved on. But it intrigued me. I thought, well, this pilot, he's throwing his career away by going public like this. He must be crazy. He ended up, it did damage his career, as it turned out.
Oh, yeah.
But I remember my brother had seen a UFO, or he claimed. So my brother Mark, and it interested me just enough to ask him again, what he saw. And Mark described this incredible encounter. He was with his friends, and he chased this UFO in his car. It was very close, treetop level, a metallic disc with a dome, colored lights, totally silent, and a fairly long encounter, 15 or 20 minutes.
That is a long encounter.
Yeah, and that's what broke the ice for me. But it wasn't long after that I started asking other people that I knew and loved, and found out I had several family members who had encounters, friends, some who had missing time. Brought it up at work. They had some really dramatic encounters to share. I mean, one lady had missing time. A UFO followed her home, her friend, and her mom, and they had missing time. Another lady, her whole family was visited by UFOs repeatedly, and the daughter was seeing grays regularly. So this hit home for me, literally.
Well, it sounds like it. But how about you? Have you seen anything?
That was my first thing I started looking into. I'm like, why am I so obsessed with this? Why is this, bothering me so much? And I scoured my past looking for anything that might indicate contact, and couldn't really find anything that would directly say, oh yeah, no UFO sightings. One maybe possible incident of missing time as a little kid, but it was pretty hard to say. But I will say that, once I started digging into this subject, I found out it was real in 1986, end of 1986, and through 87 and 88, I really dug in deep and by 89 and 90, I was interviewing people and joined all the UFO organizations. And I soon started writing articles. And by 1991 and 92, I was really, it had taken over my life to a certain extent. And that's when I started having sightings. 1992 was a huge year for me. I had probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 sightings. And the best one was I was driving home late July 1992, having stayed up late at my brother Mark's house talking about UFOs, and driving through Woodland Hills, California. It's a pretty dense suburb, but this is late at night. No cars were on the street. It was a tiny little street. And this ball of light drops down out of the sky. I thought it was a bird at first, but it clearly wasn't. It wasn't a firecracker. It came right in front of my car, right in front of my windshield, actually, just a foot or 2 away, and hovered there. Kind of moved back and forth a couple of times and then shot up and up into outer space, kind of.
Wow.
And, yeah, I think I may have been missing time because honestly, I don't remember what happened after that. And I completely forgot about it. I forgot about the whole sighting for quite a few months until one day it just sort of popped back into my head. I'm like, huh, hey, I saw that.
You know, that's typical of UFO experiencers. And I've had the same thing happen myself. I personally just remembered a sighting I had when I was 17 years old. And,
oh, wow.
And I had completely blanked it out of my mind, and something my brother said triggered it. Do you find that when you are speaking to witnesses that they have the same thing happen, same sort of thing, where they'll just suddenly remember something that happened years earlier?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that really makes me wonder, too, how many of us are having contact and don't realize it or the extent of it. I call it a cue. Some people will have an event happen, and it triggers their memory. Sometimes it just happens spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
One guy I interviewed who had an incredible sighting at a drive-in theater did not remember it at all until he was in a bookstore and saw a book on UFOs, saw the word UFO, and boom, that was his trigger. And he remembered this incredible encounter at Ascot Park Drive-In Theater where this object came right over the theater, shut the movie down, turned off all the lights. Everyone saw it. They were getting out of their cars. It was a big, big sighting, and it just moved over the theater and moved on. But
it's pretty amazing that somebody could forget about something like that over a period of time, because that's a pretty significant event. What do you think is causing that memory lapse there?
I think it's the ETs for the most part. I think there's some indications that our own minds will suppress an event, particularly if it's traumatic. I mean, we know this is true from assault victims or childhood abuse or war veterans. People will have a very traumatic event and cannot deal with it emotionally and will suppress it. And I think that does happen sometimes, particularly with onboard UFO encounters. But by and large, I would say that that's not the case, and that's the ETs themselves who are sort of putting a post-hypnotic suggestion type of thing and really sort of not erasing the memory, but certainly suppressing it. And this can happen with a simple sighting, but it's more often the case when someone has like missing time. That's exactly what's going on. This event is being pushed into their subconscious until the person is ready to deal with it. That's my assessment at this point. Right.
So, as far as UFO investigations go, does that sometimes lead you into other types of things like cryptids, things like that? Do you find a connection between UFOs and other paranormal things?
Oh, I sure do. And that became apparent pretty early on when I was interviewing people who had close encounters, and they started describing other paranormal events. I remember I was talking to a lady named Sylvia, a family friend, who had a very close-up sighting with her other friend. And she just spontaneously blurted out, well, my house is haunted too. I'm like, wait, what? Ghosts?
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure it was connected so much in that case, but it soon became clear that these events were connected. I was interviewing another lady who I worked with, whose family, I mentioned her family was having repeated encounters and the daughter was seeing grays. While all that was going on, they were suffering a pretty severe poltergeist outbreak in their home. And it was clear it was connected on some level. And I started to get more cases, which were very strange. I'd always resisted, Bigfoot, because I thought, well, what if Bigfoot is real? That's going to be opening up a can of worms. I'm not sure I want to go there. But then I got a case involving a radiologist who lived in Canyon Country here in Southern California. And Canyon Country is a somewhat remote area. It was at that time in the 70s. And it overlooks sort of the edge of the LA National Forest, which is a pretty vast tract of wilderness there. And he described a UFO encounter where a UFO landed in the fields behind his home. And it was the very next night he had a Bigfoot encounter in the same exact place. And he had telepathic contact with it. And it was a pretty extensive encounter. And following that, he had a huge poltergeist outbreak in his home with doors opening and closing and lights going on and off and cold spots and objects moving and disappearing. I mean, the whole gamut. So it became pretty clear to me that there is a connection in some cases. And that's how, I started getting drawn into doing ghost investigations and Bigfoot hunting. In that case, with the gentleman, the radiologist, I found out, there were Bigfoot sightings in that area. And started to find other weird connections to UFOs and ghosts as well. I mean, there was one case, if I might, real briefly.
Sure.
I was investigating this haunting in this apartment building in Van Nuys. And it was just this really intense haunting with dark spirits. I mean, it was not a pleasant event for these two ladies who lived in this really haunted apartment. I mean, they were seeing apparitions that would attack them. And their guests were seeing them. Their neighbor saw them. I called up the manager of the building. She's like, oh, thank God you called. We're having huge problems with ghosts in this building.
Wow.
And I interviewed a number of people. And this haunting was very intense with pretty much the entire range of phenomena. Even at one point, one of these girls nearly became possessed by these entities. At any rate, long story short, they ended up moving out and getting another apartment. And it was about 2 weeks later, that they had a very dramatic UFO sighting. This is late 1980s. And right over their new apartment. And they both thought, oh, no, is this what the poltergeist coming back? What's going on here? They ran outside because they heard this really loud buzzing noise. And it was a UFO, a boomerang-shaped object right low over their building, flashing its lights at them.
Oh, my.
And they both felt it was somehow connected to their poltergeist haunting. And I have to agree, because the coincidence was just it was too synchronistic.
What do you think the connection is between these seemingly different types of phenomena, but some people experience the gamut of paranormal? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I will say that most people who have a haunting probably won't see UFOs. Most people who encounter Bigfoot are not going to see a UFO, or so these phenomena, I think, are separate. I don't think it's the same thing wearing different masks, so to speak, as some researchers have sort of come to that conclusion. I don't believe that's what's going on here. I think one can trigger another. And by that, I mean, when someone, say, has a near-death experience, it wakes them up psychically, and they will start seeing ghosts. And UFOs are attracted to people who are strongly psychic. So what will happen is a person might be pulled on board a UFO, and this also can trigger psychic abilities within them. ETs are very intent on waking people up to their own abilities, our own abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so following an encounter, they might start seeing shadow people or having channeling or clairvoyance or precognitive dreams. And this, I think, is what's happening here. It has something to do with consciousness and awareness. And perhaps the ETs are investigating some of this stuff as well. I don't know precisely what's going on here. It's clear there is a connection. It's clear that some of this stuff can all come at once in a paranormal storm almost.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's the same phenomenon.
That's a good term, paranormal storm, because some people just have all sorts of things happening to them. But you mentioned something about how people who have been in contact with ETs or been on board a UFO do have this psychic ability that just kind of gets turned on. Or if they have a near-death experience, it gets turned on. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
Yes, it sure has. I, as I said, grew up very skeptical. I did have, as a 9-year-old kid, a major psychic event. It was so bizarre, but I didn't even know how to explain it or even categorize it. But I was watching a game show with my sister. I think it was called Treasure Hunt. And I knew all the answers to the game show. And these were sort of random questions. Like, there was 70 boxes and you had to guess which box had the check in it. And I knew, and I knew all the answers. We just laughed. And I always remind my sister about it. I'm like, remember that? And she's like, yeah, I remember. But when I started investigating UFOs, right on at the same time, I started having out-of-body experiences, really profound ones, and still do to this day, a lot of them. I got really good at it. And that, along with that, came ghost sightings, clairvoyance and precognitive dreams. Even had a Bigfoot encounter at one point that was due to, I think, an investigation where I was going out hunting for it. But yeah, I've absolutely experienced a wide gamut of paranormal phenomena personally.
Well, I must hear about the Bigfoot encounter. What happened there?
All right. Yeah, I don't talk about it a lot because, you start to say this stuff and people are like looking at you sideways. They give you a little bit of a side eye, like, oh, this guy's crazy. But when I research, I like to go into the deep end. I want to see it for myself. Because it's one thing to hear people talk about it, and it's quite another to experience it yourself. And this lady contacted me. She was actually a contactee. And she started having this Bigfoot encounters. She lived in Acton. This is sort of the desert area outside of LA, and it borders, again, the LA National Forest on the other side, the northern side. And she was describing these Bigfoot encounters. And she said, it's in telepathic contact with me. It's, came to her house. She saw it through the window. Her son saw it. Her roommate saw it. It climbed a tree next to her house and cracked a branch, which I saw. I photographed it. There were footprints. Put a big giant boulder on top of her roof. It took 3 guys to get it off. She's like, I'm thinking it's going to kidnap me or something. Does that ever happen? I told her, no, Bigfoot has never kidnapped anyone. Turns out I was wrong about that. There are a good dozen cases of Bigfoot kidnappings or more.
Yeah.
I was new to Bigfoot at that time. But at any rate, she's telling me all of this. She could hear it screaming at night, could smell it, the whole deal. And she's like, I know where it lives. I'm pretty sure where it lives in this canyon, not far from my home. I'm like, okay. And I went up there several times. She's, became a really good friend. She's now in Australia, but we were very good friends and would often, meet with each other. And went up to her house and was just interviewing her and talking about this whole Bigfoot ordeal that she was going through. and we decided we would go out to this canyon not far from her home. And she lived off the 5 freeway in Acton, as I mentioned. And so we got in her car. Or was it my car? I don't really remember, but I drove. And we drove a few miles away from her house down this dirt road into the forest. And it was around dusk and really starting to get quite dark when we arrived at this little canyon. And she gets out of the car, and we had brought equipment, camera equipment and sound equipment. And she gets out of the front passenger seat and opens the back door and is pulling out the equipment. And I get out of the driver's side, and I'm standing in front of the car when I hear this really loud roar. Very loud. I mean, I'm like, wow. I actually looked up thinking it was a plane, a jet coming over me. And Wendy, as I'll call her, she screams bloody murder. She's like, oh my God, there it is. And she jams all the equipment and throws it back into the car, jumps into the front seat, and this thing roars again. Wow. This was a long roar. I mean, 10, 20 seconds.
Oh my.
And, I'm all about bears. I love bears. I've got books on bears. It wasn't a bear. I was at the zoo when a lion roared. I know what a lion roar sounds like. I grew up with wildcats in Topanga Canyon. So I know and coyotes and all this stuff. I know what wildlife sounds like. And I can tell you this wasn't any of those. And you could feel it like rumbling in your chest. And when it roared the second time, you could kind of pinpoint where it was. And it was close. I mean, I'm guessing it was a couple of 100 yards away from us in this very steep, brushy canyon. I mean, the growth, the brush, that was so dense that you couldn't really hike there. These were steep canyon walls, 70-degree slope, perhaps. I wanted to go hiking in there, but Wendy is freaking out. She's like, get in the car. We're leaving. And I wanted to stay, but she was absolutely terrified. So reluctantly, I got in the car and we drove off.
That big, deep, guttural roar that they have, I've heard several tapes of Bigfoot sounds, and I've done some investigating on Bigfoot myself, but that just kind of just chills you to the bone, gives you goosebumps all over when you hear it, because you just, it's not just a bear, it's something really big. And you just don't know what to expect, if it's going to be something friendly to humans or not. But obviously, this creature had some interest in her.
Yeah, and I think speaks towards that connection, because she's really telepathic, super psychic. I've watched her do psychic stuff that is mind-blowing. I mean, she would predict stuff, and then it would happen. I'd be like, wow. I mean, when you're around a contactee, at some point you will experience this. She showed me UFOs twice. I know for a fact she's for real. Mm-hmm. And I think, she's very telepathic. And I think that was why this Bigfoot was so interested in her, because she could hear it and it could hear her.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why. Maybe that's part of the connection. I ended up doing a lot of Bigfoot research following this. I mean, I read all the books on it. I can tell you hands down, it is real. If you don't believe in Bigfoot, if you don't believe in Bigfoot, you haven't done your homework.
Right. Exactly.
It is real. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Jane Goodall, the very famous anthropologist,
yes,
is 100% believer in Bigfoot. The evidence for it is overwhelming.
And you have this book, Mysteries, Legends, and Unexplained Phenomena, Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Ape Men. What is this book? Obviously what it's about, but tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I was contracted to do this book by Chelsea House Publishers, and it's actually written for children, but I kept it very, I didn't dumb it down, so to speak, because children will soon become adults. And I did one on UFOs too. And a lot of kids have encounters when they're, young children. This is when often, a person who's an experiencer will experience events at a very young age. So I think it's important for kids to learn this stuff. And I covered the entire phenomena from across the world. And boy, was it interesting, because I found out that, there's Bigfoot all across the US, certainly, cases stretching back several hundred years. There's a long Native American tradition. It goes by different names in each state, whether, the Florida skunk apes is a good example. But it's all across South America. It's all across Europe, Russia, everywhere, Australia, and each of them have their names. And some of them are seeing much more akin to what we would think of as Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal, wild men.
What do you think about that theory that there's two different basic races of Bigfoot? One is the wild man, and then the other one is the supermassive, large, hairy creatures.
Yeah, I would say there's more than two races for sure.
Okay.
I would say there's dozens or even scores of different species. I think in some cases we're dealing with a simple primate who's probably intelligent to a certain degree, maybe, and some I think are absolutely intelligent, sentient, and psychic, and have abilities that we would consider supernatural. I don't think they are supernatural. I think they're natural. We just don't understand it. But they have the ability to move interdimensionally and do all kinds of stuff. Because telepathy comes up in a number of these Bigfoot accounts. It's really amazing. And California is probably the leading producer of Sasquatch reports. And they're very, very tall here. But there are reports of much shorter beings, 3, 4, 5 feet tall, and very much human-looking ones, and just a wide variety of entities that we would term Bigfoot or Sasquatch or wild men.
There's so much out there that basic science does not understand, and they don't pursue it. I've never been able to understand why a scientist who supposedly wants to understand everything draws a line and says, I'm not crossing that line. Why do you think they do that?
Yeah, science is I love science. I majored in science in college. I found it fascinating because here's a pathway to true knowledge. But science becomes somewhat of a closed system. To a certain extent, because anything that doesn't fit scientific mainstream theory tends to be discarded. And we see this with anthropology. Michael Cremo wrote a book called Forbidden Archaeology, where he showed that evidence that doesn't fit mainstream theory is being thrown out and ignored. And a lot of scientists have looked into Bigfoot and been converted. Many of the major Bigfoot researchers started out as full on, Jeff Meldrum is a good example. He was an anthropologist who, risked his reputation and did suffer to a certain extent because of it. I think it takes courage to move against the mainstream. And this is what we see with pioneers. Often people who are pioneering new levels of knowledge, whether it's, Galileo or Aristotle or whomever, are ridiculed or even attacked, and only later are hailed as heroes or true pioneers of scientific thought. So it's a difficult path to uncover new knowledge. People are resistant to it for whatever reason. It's really unfortunate. The UFO field is suffering badly from this, and I think this is something that does retard scientific progress on multiple levels of knowledge.
Yeah, most certainly. Of course, the biggest one is UFO, because millions of people have seen them, and many of these people have seen them multiple times, and go so far as being abducted or actually seeing ETs or having telepathic contact with ETs. There's so many people who have had this, but yet when we have our meetings and with different UFO groups, we still have new people come in and they say, oh, I haven't been able to tell anyone about this. I can't tell my family. I can't even tell my spouse. And I'm so glad to be able to talk to this other group of people. And then we have 50 or 100 or 200 people at just a regular meeting, and they're shocked. They can't believe there's so many other people who've seen
right.
So that just shows right there that people are quiet about the subject.
Yeah,
they're afraid to talk about it,
especially if you've had a major encounter, like seeing ETs face to face or being pulled on board.
Oh yeah,
people are very reluctant to speak of sightings. I think people are more willing to talk about, especially if it's a distant sighting. But if it gets close and affects you personally, and I think part of the reason is not only people are embarrassed and afraid of ridicule and skepticism, but truthfully, there's an active cover-up. We have been, as witnesses, attacked, ridiculed. Our own tax dollars are being used by our own governments, and this is not just the US, to ridicule, to make witnesses look like liars, hoaxers, fools. Our government is lying about the subject. They are actively trying to suppress it and spending a lot of time, money, and effort to do so, which is really unfortunate and can't go on and won't go on forever, because you cannot hide the sky. You cannot hide the truth forever. At some point, all of this will come out, and we're seeing it come out now. I'm really upset with our government for doing this. I'm not blaming everyone within government. There's a percentage, a small group of people at very high levels within our military, mostly the military-industrial complex. I'll point to the Navy and the Army and the Air Force at the very highest levels, who know full well this is real. That recent disclosure report was nice for them to mention the possibility that some of these things the Navy is seeing are UFOs. But what are they talking about? Possibility. They already know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Let's go on here. You've got a book, Area 51. What is this one about?
Yeah, this is something I was able to contribute chapter to. This is a book published by the late Timothy Green Beckley. Big shout out to him. He just recently passed away, but he helped me very early on in my research. He was the first to publish my articles and often asked me to contribute to his various books. And this one was about Area 51, where I have done a bunch of research on it, because I wrote a book called UFOs over Nevada, which I had a whole chapter on Area 51, and I've talked to some whistleblowers. In fact, in my latest book, WONDROUS, I talked to a gentleman who found out all kinds of information about Area 51. Apparently, this is a real base. There are lots of whistleblowers coming out. It's not just Bob Lazar. A lot of major researchers, such as Bill Hamilton or Linda Moulton Howe and George Knapp, of course, and many others have firsthand reports. And the gentleman I spoke with was able to connect with some Area 51 insiders who said that there is a very large underground complex there that houses many thousands of people, and each level works on a different area of knowledge. One is all about bacterial and germ warfare. Another is about genetic research. Another is reverse engineering. And at the lowest levels, they're working directly with ETs, he said. And one of the interesting things I found out about Area 51, I read in actually Fate magazine. Fate magazine did an experiment where they asked their readership to see if they could psychically visit Area 51 using psychic impressions, remote viewing, astral travel, clairvoyance, and they got a bunch of respondents, all women, by the way. I found that fascinating. Exclusively women.
Wow.
Which, in my ghost research, there's twice as many women and children who see ghosts as opposed to men. Whereas with the UFO research, it's evenly divided perfectly. So there's something about that. I think women are probably more intuitive. At any rate, these respondents found all, their psychic impressions matched exactly with what people were seeing, or the whistleblowers were reporting. But they did say one thing. 4 of them said something which I have not heard. And this always just is so interesting to me, because I've done research into UFO healing cases. And 4 of these women talked about how the employees at Area 51 have been genetically enhanced or implanted so that their health is majorly improved. They are using ET technology to extend their lifespan. That's one woman said. Another was like, they have, altered their DNA to improve their health status. They all had various variations of how they were, affected by ETs and ET technology to improve their health.
Oh my goodness. So these are actual implants that do the job?
Yes. And
that's amazing.
That really fascinated me, because I've done research into alien implants, certainly. And talked to a lot of people who've been dealing with this. And there's a lot of speculation, like, what are implants for? And I think the prevailing opinion is it's for tracking people.
Yeah.
Or even affecting them mentally, like mind control type of thing. But I have to tell you, I've talked to experiencers who asked the ETs, or were told by the ETs, what the purpose for the implant was. And I've read several accounts as well in the UFO literature. And by and large, it's all focusing on health. One lady was told by the ETs, this is to measure the level of pollution in your body. Another says, we're keeping tracks on your vital signs, on your health. Another was told it's to boost your immune system. I talked to one lady, she expelled an implant out of her nose. She sneezed and it came out, and she's looking at it. And as in all of these cases, she felt this strong impulse to just throw it away, which often happens.
It does. I can vouch for that.
It's very frustrating. Or people will put it in an envelope and it disappears from the envelope, or a jar. I mean, it's hard to keep track of these things.
Most certainly.
But following expelling this implant, she became very ill with a hypoglycemia type illness, and ended up having an experience and being re-implanted and healed. So I think there is strong evidence that these implants are for healing purposes. One lady asked, is this for tracking? And they said, no, we can track you by your vibration, which makes sense, because there are people who have had their implant removed by Dr. Roger Lear. I talked to this lady who had that experience. I interviewed her, and after her implant was removed, the ETs came back. They found her easily 2 weeks later and re-implanted her.
I've had the same thing with several witnesses who have implants, and in a couple of cases they took them out themselves, or they came out in some fashion, either through the skin or through the nose, like you said. That's happened to actually several of my witnesses that I've spoken to. And then they have another encounter, and there's a new implant somewhere else. They've got, they feel something in their neck or their wrist or something like that. And so I've come to the conclusion as well that if it comes out, they're going to be visiting again, and they're going to put another one in. But, this is one aspect. Everybody has always, pretty much been thinking that these implants are for tracking, but indeed they could be entirely for something different, and for healing. And that, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm wondering if you think this too, as far as the ET involvement with humans, they seem to be by far benevolent in their treatment, and they seem to have an interest in us, no matter, whether they created us or whatever, but in assisting us rather than harming us. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. And this is a tricky question because there are a lot of experiences out there who have been quite traumatized. It's not unusual for an experiencer to grow up with this and have PTSD and nightmares and not having a good time with it and have a strong fear reaction. And when I first became involved in this field, I was somewhat horrified. I'm like, oh my gosh, people are being abducted, kidnapped against their will, experimented on by bug-like aliens who seem to have little compassion for their fear. And that seems to be true in a number of cases. The ETs are surprised by a person's strong fear reaction. And that's what they told Whitley Strieber. Like, why are you screaming? What can we do to help you stop screaming? They didn't understand. So I feel like that happens quite a bit. But if you objectively look at what is actually happening to a person who's taken on board, the very worst thing people describe generally is this physical examination, which can be very scary and is occasionally painful, not usually. But if a person doesn't have a strong fear reaction, they're not paralyzed, their memories are not necessarily erased or suppressed, and they're treated quite differently. And what I see with contactees very often is it will start out scary and then move towards a very spiritual experience for them. And that as they confront their fear and deal with this, they come to realize that this is not evil at all. Very, very few people that I've spoken with will outright call these ETs evil. What I have virtually zero cases of is what I would call sadistic behavior or torturing or ETs going, trying to scare you. No, that's not their agenda at all. The first thing they will tell a person is, do not be afraid. We will not harm you. We have not come to harm you. Have no fear.
Mm-hmm.
And they try hard because we are trained to fear. And people do have a strong fear reaction. And there's an ET threat narrative being put forth by the people who are covering this up. And the media focuses on lurid and scary aspects of it. And what I found is, no, this is actually benevolent. This is good news for us. This is, I think, what Barbara Lamb found out, Dolores Cannon, John Mack. Not all researchers have come to this conclusion. Some are, still fear-based. But I think we have to pull our emotions out of this a little bit and look at it objectively. Because what happens when a person is taken on board? Yes, they're physically examined. And this is often when they are healed. I wrote a whole book on this too, actually. The Healing Power of UFOs documents some 300 cases. My first book, there it is, UFO Healings. That was my first book, has 100 cases of healings. And that's when I started to wake up. I'm like, they are healing us. Why? That's not the actions of a hostile species. And not only do they heal people, they will take you on a tour of the ship. They will show you the engine room and say, this is how we power our craft. Why are you using fossil fuels? And they will give warnings against nuclear proliferation, our warlike ways. They will take you to the helm, the control room, and say, here's how we fly our craft. Would you like to fly it? That's not unusual. People are taught how to fly the craft. They are given warnings, as I mentioned. There's a very, very strong spiritual aspect to people's experiences, by and large. And we talked a bit about this already. People are given a huge boost in psychic abilities. Almost as a rule, people come away from their close encounters with a strong interest in healing, hands-on healing, Reiki, in environmentalism, in animal rights, human rights, channeling, clairvoyance, past life recall, astral travel, out-of-body experiences. One lady I interviewed in Maine, she was having experiences with grays. It was very scary for her in the beginning. And the ETs pulled her on board, gave her a bunch of prophecies, told her all this stuff. She had hybrid babies and the whole deal. And they said, here's our gift to you. We have boosted your psychic abilities. This is our gift to you for what you have given to us. And I've heard that same exact phrase in multiple cases. This is our gift to you for what you have given to us. So,
yeah. And there are some negative experiences. What do you think about the reptilians? Are they a benevolent race? Are they being kept at bay by the good guys, so to speak?
The reptilians. I haven't gotten a whole lot of reptilian cases, and the ones I have gotten were not particularly benevolent. I do know that people have had benevolent experiences. I've talked to some of them. Pamela Stonebrook was one. Barbara Lamb, she had a benevolent experience with the reptilian. But I've heard of some hostile cases. One lady I interviewed encountered a reptilian in the Florida Everglades, and she felt quite certain it wanted to eat her for lunch. And she took off running. So I think they're real. Often it's very interesting to me because not every case involves a UFO necessarily. People will just encounter these out in the wilderness somewhere. And there's a good deal of speculation that these guys are living on Earth, underground. Mm-hmm. Some feel like they can shapeshift and are infiltrating our society and are responsible for some of the ills of our planet, some of the greed and, the divisiveness and so forth, the evils that we're experiencing here on our planet.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know. But ET behavior falls under a bell curve. Some is not so good. Most is benevolent, but it falls under the same umbrella as human behavior. I think it would be much easier to prove humans as a hostile species as to most ETs. But the reptilians, I haven't specialized in them. I don't get a lot of cases, so it's hard for me to speak to it. But yeah,
I don't like to focus on them either. It's because it seems like when you focus on something, it comes to you. Now, this book, Schoolyard UFO Encounters, you've got a number of cases in here. Why don't we just pick one and talk about it? What's the most significant one that you can remember?
Oh, there's 100 cases. I was quite surprised to find out that this is a thing because there are a few famous cases in the literature. The Rua, Zimbabwe case at Ariel Elementary is quite well known, or the Westall High School landing in Australia.
Yes.
Or Opelika, Florida, Crestview Elementary School. One that I tracked personally occurred at Point Elementary School in Missouri, I think it is. And I talked to the witness firsthand. And she was out on the playground with her friends, and 6 of them decided they were going to play tag instead of foursquare with all the other kids. And they went off to the far end of the field and saw these lights in the trees behind the school. This is how it always happens. I mean, of the 100 cases, 30% of these cases involve landings or humanoids. This is a thing. UFOs are targeting schools, showing themselves off to children on purpose. And so they thought it was an ice cream truck. And they went off school grounds, which they knew was against the rules, but couldn't help it. They went and started running towards these lights and saw it was actually a craft landed on the ground, and there was a humanoid standing next to it or near it, not quite next to it, a couple of 100 yards away. But they walked right up to this humanoid, and they were 50 feet away from it or so. And they all stood in a row and looked at this thing, which was looking right back at them. And it was not a gray. I haven't heard anyone describe a being quite like this. Melody is her name. She said it had very dark skin, face kind of like a primate, like a gorilla almost, but was wearing a jumpsuit. It looked very muscular, had large dark eyes. And as soon as they saw it and it saw them, it backed up and went into its craft. And at that point, as it was doing that, the teacher, Mrs. Ohlendorf, came up behind them and screamed and pulled them back onto the playground and into the school. And at this point, all the other kids saw the craft, and they were rushing to the windows and looking at it. And she called in the principal. They ended up pulling everyone into the gymnasium, and it stopped school for that day. School was cut short, and they called the buses and were sending people home. The UFO took off. They saw it take off through the windows. It was a big, big event and was the buzz of the school for weeks, though the teachers refused to discuss it and forbade the children from talking about it in class.
Oh, an internal cover-up. Wow. Do you remember when that happened?
Yeah, that was 1966.
66. Okay.
Yeah, and it was like March or so, the same time as the Hillsdale College sighting in Michigan, by the way. And that's another very famous incident where a UFO landed right next to a school. Half of these cases involve elementary schools, so it's mostly targeting the youngest of our children, but also happening at junior high, high schools, and colleges. And it was 2 weeks after the Hillsdale sighting. There's a weird timing aspect to a lot of these cases. They'll target one school and move to another and then wait a while and then go to another. It's like a book tour. But it was 2 weeks after the Hillsdale case that the Westall High School case occurred, where a UFO again landed next to the school. And it was funny, right after Hillsdale happened, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, some of my favorite researchers, really true pioneers, said, this is one of many cases we've gotten of UFOs hovering over schools. Something important is going on here. This is probably going to happen again. So they basically predicted the Melbourne case. And Ray Fowler also said the same thing. Following the Hillsdale case, he said of the cases he had investigated that year, during that time period, there was 15 that he declared unknown. 7 of them occurred over schools.
Was there a certain time period when these occurred, or are they ongoing?
Well, looking back, I did a study of them, and started pretty much precisely in 1950. I did find one outlier involving a case at Burritt College in Tennessee, dated all the way back to 1853.
Wow.
But yeah, 1950 onwards. And in these cases, it's always the same pattern. These usually occur during the day. That's significant because daylight sightings are somewhat rare. Mm-hmm. These are very low-level sightings. The average sighting is, anomalous light at night that's thousands of feet high. These are low-level sightings. 100 feet, 300 feet, 50 feet, 10 feet, or even landing. Very low-level sightings. These are not brief. The average sighting is quite brief. These sightings are 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, sometimes over a period of days.
Oh, my.
So these are very significant and unusual. I mean, there's really nothing like it in the UFO literature. The only thing that I found was similar ended up being the subject of the next book after that, which was UFOs over drive-in theaters.
Right.
Which is so strange, but it's the same thing. And this was so shocking to me because who knew? But yes, I can tell you, I found 100 cases of UFOs hovering over drive-in theaters at very low level, right above the screen, right next to the screen, showing themselves to hundreds of people and putting on a display. In these cases, they are not just, floating there. They will flash their lights.
So they obviously want to be seen.
Exactly. They're putting on a display. They will release smaller objects. They will dart around. They are putting on a show for the kids at schools or for the people at the drive-in theaters. This isn't happening to that level at music concerts, outdoor events, sporting events. There are a handful of cases, but it's nothing like what we're seeing going on at schools and drive-in theaters.
Mm-hmm. Now, the schools, do these sightings occur just when the children are by themselves, or are teachers nearby as well, or adults?
Over half of the cases do involve teachers. There are some that do not, which is very interesting to me. But absolutely more than half have adult witnesses. So any arguments like, oh, kids are imaginative, and they're making things up and don't have a real sense of reality, that doesn't hold water, not for a second, because these are widely viewed sightings. They've been photographed, by the way, on a number of occasions. There are landing traces. They're very low-level sightings. And yeah, adults are seeing them. There's a case in New Zealand, Maranui, New Zealand, where 400 kids were out on the playground, and a number of teachers saw this object. It approached, and as it always does, approaches either from the high above or the horizon. It comes right over the school and stops. And that's what it did. And it stayed there for 10, 15 minutes. And it was huge. It covered a good portion of the sky. One of the kids ran up to the teacher, was like, "Mister, is that a UFO?" And he's like, "Yeah, I think it is." And then it turned sideways, as they often will do, and took off straight up quite rapidly. Yeah, very widely viewed in some cases.
I've found that in a lot of cases, people either don't have a camera, or if they do, they don't think to take the picture. They've got a cell phone or a camera in their hand. What do you think is the story behind that?
Yeah, I've heard it a million times. Experienced it myself when I saw a UFO. I just didn't even think of the camera. I knew someone who had a camera on their seat next to them, and they kept wanting to do it, but each time they'd reach for it, it just wouldn't happen. I've had people actually grab a camera and cell phones, and the cameras failed. There was a case on Catalina Island with 11 witnesses. 3 or 4 of them were professional photographers. And all of their cameras malfunctioned, as did their flashlights and their watches. So sometimes the ETs will purposefully power down a camera. One guy had a cell phone camera, brand new, pointed at the UFO, powers down to 0. Points it away, powers back up. Points it back, powers down to 0. Another case on Catalina Island, same thing. 2 people had cell phones, and as soon as they pointed it, the UFO, it powered down. So I think
So they want those people to see it, but not anyone else.
Yeah, UFOs will occasionally pose for photographs, and this is why we get some really clear photographs sometimes. And sometimes they will allow it, but often no. Like when the Hudson Valley wave was occurring, lots of people tried to photograph it, and it just wouldn't work. Some did manage to capture photographs. Ellen Crystal, she ended up writing a book, Silent Invasion, an excellent book. And she got some really interesting photographs. But she was on a mission, and I think they allowed her to photograph them to some extent. But yeah, I think this is why we have so many blurry photographs. And unfortunately, there's a lot of hoaxing going on, a lot of disinformation in this field. So I am not so trusting of a lot of particularly recent photographs.
Right. Yeah, the recent photographs can be photoshopped fairly easily. Although, a good analyst could figure that out, but you're wasting your time a lot of times. Nothing makes me more upset than a hoax, because it's a total waste of our time as an investigator. But fortunately, those are few and far between.
Yeah,
most people who report have had a legitimate encounter, and most people also don't want any publicity about it. So
exactly,
that's a genuine event there. Unfortunately, we are out of time this evening. Thank you so much for being on the show, Preston. This hour has flown by. Where can people get a hold of all of your books, and especially your new one?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. I do have a website. If you just use a search engine on my name, you should be able to find it. The actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. I'm also I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, YouTube, and really trying to get the word out there. People can contact me, by the way, through my website if you want. If you have a story to share or a comment or a question, I'm always happy to hear from people. I think this is an important subject. I think it's going to change the world. We're going to have disclosure at some point. probably not through governments, maybe a smaller government. Doubt it's going to be the US. But disclosure will happen at some point, and we're going to have open official contacts sooner or later. I'm guessing sooner. We seem to be moving really quickly towards this. This is something contactees are being told. So, thanks for having me on the show. This is a very important subject.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope you'll come back again sometime soon. And I know we're going to have you at the OBS Paracon in March of 2022, and I'm looking forward to that as well. Thank you so much, Preston.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a delight.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
This is Margie K, and we will be back here next week, 5 o'clock on Fridays. Be sure to set your calendar and also subscribe to this site so that you get the notices. See you next time.